Hello, my name is Euro and welcome to another Baldur's Gate 3 build video. In today's video I'll be showing you my Ice Wizard build, which is a pure wizard with no multi-class build that is focused on dealing mostly cold damage and inflicting effects caused by cold damage from our equipment, such as Shield, which makes enemies vulnerable to cold damage and lightning damage, and also encrusted with Frost that at 7 stacks can potentially cause enemies to become frozen, or if they succeed the save against it, they just take additional cold damage instead. Now, you could do this type of a build with a sorcerer, particularly the Storm Sorcerer, who has greater synergy with cold, lightning, and thunder damage, while also being able to cast Create Water as a bonus action using meta magic. But since we will be focusing on only cold damage itself, I think a wizard is potentially a better pick here, as wizards have some access to cold spells the sorcerers don't, as well as being able to pick and choose spells on the fly outside of combat, as well as learning various spells from scrolls, granting us greater versatility. So we are going to be going as a wizard in this video. So for your character creation, we're going as a human in my example. You can go as any other race you may prefer, but I've chosen a human. A great pick would be a high elf or a half elf. Reason being is they get access to one additional wizard cantrip. If I'm not mistaken, the cantrips pool that they pull from is the wizard one, since those cantrips also scale with your intelligence, so you would have one additional cantrip at the beginning. But if you do choose to go as a human like I did, you do gain the Civil Militia feature, which gives you proficiency with spears, spikes, halberds, and glaives, and also proficiency with light armor and shields. Shields being very good here because that is the way we can get 2 additional armor class in the early game. We also gain the human versatility, which gives us an additional skill we are proficient with, and also increases our carrying capacity by a quarter. Class, as we mentioned, we're going to be going as a wizard. Wizards gain the Arcane Recovery, which lets us replenish spell slots outside of combat, though we cannot restore a spell that's higher than level 5, which is fine because we can use an amulet to restore that anyway. For the cantrips, we're going of course with the Ray of Frost. This reduces your target's movement speed and deals 1d8 cold damage. This is useful because this inflicts a condition and is going to be a good combination with one of our pieces of equipment. For the second cantrip, we're going with Firebolt. This is purely here just so we have a secondary damage type, and also it is very useful for igniting surfaces and particularly while utilizing Barrelmancy if you do not have access to fire arrows. For a third cantrip, we're going with Friends. This gives us advantage in charisma checks against non-hostile creatures. This is a very useful dialogue cantrip that lets you get advantage, of course, though you have to be careful on higher difficulties, because if you do not leave the area while the effect expires, the person you casted is on will call for guards and you'll be accused of enchanting them, going into trouble with the law. Now, if you did go for a high elf or a half elf, for your fourth cantrip, I would suggest picking up either Light, Mage Hand, or Minor Illusion. Light being particularly useful for Act 2. Mage Hand itself being nice because you can interact with various objects, especially in one of the Underdark areas where you need to pull a lever behind a gate. And of course, Minor Illusion allowing you to herd and displace enemies because they will go and investigate it. For our spells, we're going with, of course, Mage Armor, very important for wizards because this gives us 13 armor class plus our dexterity modifier and lasts until long rest. For the second spell, we're taking Shield. This makes it so as a reaction you gain 5 armor class and you have also the effect of not taking damage from magic missiles, which is very useful. One of the better spells in the first level. For a third spell, we're going with the Long Strider. This increases the movement speed by 3 meters until long rest. So this spell itself, it does not say it here, but this is a ritual spell, so if you cast this outside of combat on your entire party, it will not cost you a spell slot, and if you upcast it, you can cast it on more than one person. For a fourth spell, we're going with the Magic Missile. This shoots 3 darts, each dealing 2 to 5 force damage, and they always hit their targets. This spell is amazing because it allows us to confirm or to take out low HP enemies without potentially missing them 3 times in a row, as it sometimes does happen, so this is great for ensuring we kill targets. For a fifth spell, we're going with the Chromatic Orb. This deals 3 to 24 damage. It can be thunder, lightning, cold, any kind of elemental damage. You can pick and choose when you cast it. This is a good early game damage spell. It does get outshined later as you level up by cantrips, so we can also then, as we level up, replace it by something else, but for now it's going to serve us. Alternatively, instead of the Chromatic Orb, you could take the Ice Knife. This deals 1d10 piercing damage if it doesn't miss the target, and also explodes for 2 to 12 damage to anyone nearby if they do not succeed the saving throw. So this is also a small AoE spell, so later on when you gain effects of the Engrust the Frost and Shield, you can potentially deal those or place those effects onto enemies in a small area. And for our last spell, we're going to go with Thunder Wave. This is a useful utility spell for pushing enemies away from you or pushing them off of cliffs. For our background, I went with the Guild Artisan. This gives us skills in Insight and Persuasion, and it has quite a decent amount of triggers for inspiration. Now, of course, as always, you can choose any other background you may think is more fitting for your role-playing purposes. For our ability scores, we're going with 14 Dexterity, 16 Constitution, 17 Intelligence, and 10 Wisdom. 14 Dexterity is well used for here because it is going to give us +2 to our armor class and initiative, and Constitution is important so that we have a little bit more HP, and it's going to help us save those concentration saving throws. Intelligence is important for us because, of course, we are a wizard. We are a intelligence-based spellcaster. And 10 Wisdom here. This is optional. You could remove the Wisdom and put it into Charisma instead. This is up to you. I just prefer having 10 Wisdom. For the skill proficiencies, I would most likely just remove Survival and Religion, and I'll put it instead into Deception, Intimidation, or Performance. I'll place it into Deception, and then for the second point here, I would probably just put it into Arcana. Alright, so for level 2, we unlock our subclass, and we will be going with the Evocation. Reason being, our subclass features Sculpt spells, makes it so that we create pockets of safety within our Evocation spells. Allies automatically succeed their saving throws against these spells, and they take no damage from them. So essentially, the majority of the cold damage spells that we'll be using and having access to, they are pretty much Evocation spells, so we don't have to worry about, for example, the Cone of Cold damaging our allies or Thunder Wave pushing our allies away. So this is very nice. For the spells that you can pick here, I would suggest taking Ice Knife if you didn't already. And then for the rest of these spells, you can learn all of them pretty much from scrolls, except Find Familiar. So if you want to have a Find Familiar, I would suggest picking it up here. If you don't care about it, then I would suggest taking something like Protection from Evil and Good, because you can get usefulness out of it even in the late game, because this grants a disadvantage to Aberrations, Celestials, Elementals, Fey, Fiends, and Undead when they attack you. You can't be frightened or charmed or even possessed by them. So this is a very handy spell to have even in the later stages of the game. For the prepared spells, we're going to go with, of course, crucially, Mage Armor, Shield, and Magic Missile. And then if you do not have Long Strider, I would pick it up here. And then for the last one, I would take Thunder Wave so that we can push away enemies from us. Moving on to level 3. We unlock second level spells, and here I would suggest you pick up Misty Step and Hold Person. Misty Step being the amazing mobility spell, and Hold Person being a great spell for basically making enemies hold still, and then your allies that are melee, they can get guaranteed critical hits on them. And then for the prepared spells, I would suggest you take Misty Step here so that we have some mobility. And of course here you could potentially remove Thunder Wave and put Ice Knife or Chromatic Orb instead, but I will be keeping Thunder Wave for now. At level 4, we unlock one additional cantrip, and here, if you didn't get it already with your High Elf or Half Elf cantrip, I would suggest you take Light. This will be a very useful cantrip to have in Act 2. For our other second level spells here, I've went with the Gust of Wind. Now it is not necessarily better than the Thunder Wave, as it is a second level spell, but this, when the enemies fail to save, they get pushed away by 5 meters, and they also get off balance. This makes it so your allies have an advantage against them. So this can be handy, but Thunder Wave is arguably better because it guarantees you deal damage and potentially push them away. But I will go with the Gust of Wind there, since this is what I've been experimenting with in my build, and it actually does work quite decently well because it has I believe a longer area of effect, but not wider than the Thunder Wave. And then for the second spell, I would suggest taking up Mirror Image. This gives you 3 armor class and 3 illusional images. Every time an enemy misses you, you lose one of the mirror images. And then of course, if you do not want Gust of Wind, you can take something like Blur, so enemies have a disadvantage against you, or a great pick of course is something like Shatter or even the Cloud of Daggers. For prepared spells, here I would suggest you take, at this point, Hold Person. This can be useful, especially if you try to steal from merchants, if you don't use any other exploits or cheeses. Now for first feat, normally we would always go +2 into intelligence, but since we only have 3 feats with this character, we will forego the ability improvement, and instead we're going to take Elemental Adept and we will put it into Cold here. Now what this is going to do, it makes it so our spells that we cast and attacks that we make ignore resistances to cold damage, and in addition, when we deal cold damage with a spell, we cannot roll a 1. So this is very useful for increasing our damage overall with the cold spells, while preventing us from dealing 1 damage, which is very good. At level 5, we unlock our 3rd level spells, and here I would suggest you pick up the haste spell and counter spell. Counter spell always being very useful because you can of course nullify up to 5th level, or actually all level spells from enemies, which is very important, especially when some of the enemies start casting Cloud Kill on you. And haste will be actually one of those spells we will be utilizing quite heavily, because we will want to increase our damage quite significantly. And especially for Honor mode, this is much better on Spellcaster than it is on Fighter, since haste second action does not trigger extra attack, but we can cast 2 spells regardless then. So this will be one of our signature spells throughout the entire playthrough. For the prepared spells, I would suggest you actually use haste here. This will allow you to essentially double your damage for 10 turns, if hopefully enemies don't focus you down and try to break your concentration, which we'll be fixing that in level 8. At level 6, we unlock Potent Cantrip. This just makes it so if our cantrip has a saving throw, it deals half of its damage regardless if the enemy saves or not. Of course, if they don't save, then they take full damage. For the other 3rd level spells here, I would suggest going with Sleet Storm. Now, Sleet Storm is kind of a sleeper spell, because what it does, it calls forth a storm that disrupts enemy concentration, or concentration of spellcasters generally, and douses fires and creates an ice surface. Now, the ice surface that you create with this actually scales with your spell save DC, meaning at later stages it will be almost impossible for enemies to walk over the ice. They will most likely always slip, and essentially you just make it so that most of the times enemies that are caught by this Sleet Storm are just going to be falling prone non-stop, and of course you will prevent them from concentrating on any spells. So this is actually a really good crowd control spell. And for the 2nd spell, I would suggest you pick up Slow. Slow is a very good 3rd level spell that allows you to target up to 6 creatures, slowing them, which makes it so it halves their movement speed, reduces their armor, removes their bonus actions, or not bonus actions, it removes their reactions, and then forces them to either do 1 action or 1 bonus action. So it essentially just completely halves their effectiveness. For the prepared spells here, I would suggest you pick up the Sleet Storm or Slow. Either one will work just fine for you. At level 7, we unlock our 4th level spells, and here we are of course taking the Ice Storm, and we will also take Fire Shield. Ice Storm being a invocation spell, so our allies will not be getting damaged by it. It is a large AoE area effect, and also makes so that targets that save, they still take half of the damage, which is very useful. Though you should be mindful with this, if you do manage to get enemies frozen and you cast Ice Storm after they're frozen, this bludgeoning damage will actually break the ice and they will no longer be frozen, so this is just something you should be mindful of. And the Fire Shield, this allows us to get a Fire Shield cold, so that whenever an enemy attacks us, we can of course deal damage back to them in the cold form. For the equipped spells, or for the propelled spells, I would suggest you take Ice Storm. At level 8, we can unlock 2 additional spells, and here I would suggest you to take Conjure Minor Elemental and Dimension Door. Minor Elementals are nice here because you can summon Ice Memphis. They are immune to your cold damage, and they also can cause enemies to go prone with their Ice Breath. And if you need to, of course, you can always just explode them to deal AoE damage to enemies around you. So now, for the prepared spells, I would here suggest you take either the Conjure Minor Elemental or the Fire Shield. For our second feat, we will be taking Warcaster. This is going to give us advantage on concentration semi-throws and give us a reaction to cast Shocking Grasp targets moving out of melee range. But main importance of this is to get the advantage on concentration semi-throws, as we'll be concentrating on haste quite a bit. At level 9, we unlock our 5th level spell, and here I would suggest you of course take the Cone of Cold and Conjure Elemental. The elemental that you conjure here, the Water Elemental, With its melee attacks, it can cause enemies to be chilled and it creates a puddle of water. It also has the Winter's Breath attack, which is essentially the same thing as the Ice Breath of the Memphis, but a larger, and I believe has a little bit more damage. And the Water Elemental also, with his multi-attack, does double damage against chilled enemies. So the Elemental will buff you and itself as well. For the equipped spells here, I would suggest you pick up either Cone of Cold or the Conjure Elemental. I will go with the Cone of Cold. At level 10, we unlock now another cantrip, and here it doesn't really matter what you pick. I will just take Minor Illusion. For the other spells you can unlock here, I would always suggest you take Hold Person. This is very important, a very powerful spell if you need to crowd control some particularly dangerous enemies. And if you want to experiment with something rather interesting, you could take the Autolux Resilient Sphere. This encloses a target in a sphere of shimmering force, blocking all incoming damage and spell effects. The sphere reduces target's movement speed by half and also prevents it from casting spells all during damage. So what this means is if you cast this on an enemy, it's gonna reduce the movement speed and they will not be able to deal damage. So essentially for 3 turns, you will just prevent an enemy from doing anything other than just moving around a little bit. So I'll be taking this for now. For our equipped spells, here I would suggest you take the Conjure Elemental. Also keep in mind that you can take Hold Person. And also you will have greater access of prepared spells once you increase your intelligence with the Ontiatal Sare, which you should do at around level 5 so that you get another spell slot so you can have additional spells equipped. Let's move on. At level 11, we unlock our 6th level spells. And here, we unfortunately do not have that great... Well, we do have one good cold spell, which is the Autolux Freezing Sphere. A huge area of effect damaging spell that, of course, is an evocation, so it will not target allies, so we will be taking that. Now, the Wall of Ice. Wall of Ice sounds great. It deals 10d6 cold, and then again 10d6 cold, so 20 to 120. But it's not that good, because the initial summon of it deals 10 to 60 cold damage, and then if you break the ice, the mist itself can also deal 10 to 60 cold damage. It can be useful in areas such as like tight corridors where you can force enemies to walk through it a lot more, but a lot of the other times they will either just go around it or they will just jump through it, dealing only one instance of the cold damage itself. But regardless, we will take it because it can be sometimes rather handy. And here we will equip the Autolux Freezing Sphere. Now, as you mentioned, at this point, you will be able to summon water myrmidons, which have the healing vapors ability, which in a large area of effect heals everybody, but also makes them wet, which means you will have double damage against them. And lastly, for level 12, here you can pick up something like the Globe of Invulnerability, although you should have plenty of these scrolls of this spell, which just makes the Act 3 rather quite easy. And then for a last spell, it doesn't really matter. You could pick anything. You could maybe take the Glyph of Warding for a ice damaging of the glyph, or some other spell. So I will just take the Glyph of Warding. And then for the prepared spells here, you can go with any of the ones that we have here. Of course, you would have equipped the counter spell here after you have increased your intelligence throughout the Ethel. So, and also if you did the Mirror Loss. So you would have additional 2 to 3 more spells. Now for our last feat, we will be going with Dual Wielder. There it is. So this will allow us to dual wield 2 staff. The cold damage staff that we gain in Act 1 and one of the 2 staffs we gain in Act 3, particularly Marco Heshkir, so that we can get the, I believe it's called Kreshka's Favor for additional cold damage bonuses. But now we're gonna go into the equipment section. Alright, so here we are in the equipment section. So as you can see, there aren't too many items that synergize with cold that much, but there are enough to where we can make a solid loadout, so to say. So for our hat, we're going with the Cold Brim hat, which gives us the effect that once per turn, any condition inflicted on a target also applies 2 turns of Encrusted with Frost. Meaning affected entity has disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. Essentially, they have a disadvantage on saving for not slipping on ice. When there are 7 or more turns remaining, the entity must succeed a Constitution saving throw or take 1d4 cold damage and become frozen. Now, being frozen means the affected entity is utterly enameled in ice and is incapacitated. If it is dealt bludgeoning, thunder, or force damage, the ice shatters, ending the condition. So this is where I mentioned before, you should be careful with Ice Storm because you can free frozen enemies with it because it deals a little bit of cold damage. For a cloak, we're going with the Cloak of the Weave. You gain +1 bonus to spell save DC and spell attack rolls. Just a nice cloak for increasing our spell casting capabilities. Now, I did try to roll with the Wave Mother's Cloak because of the damp ages, but it didn't work the way I thought it was, and I don't know why I thought it worked like that. So basically what it does is during combat, once per turn, the cloak grants the wearer water layer protection. Essentially, it makes you wet since you can't burn or you are resistant to fire, but you are vulnerable to lightning and cold. So originally what I thought that this cloak does is after you get hit by an attack, the cloak explodes and makes all entities in the area around you wet. I don't know why I thought it worked like that, but I did. But it does not work like that. It does not sound that good. So instead, I went for the Cloak of Weave. Now, alternatively, you could go with the Cloak of Protection, +1 to armor class and saving throws, and also Cloak of Displacement makes it so that enemies have disadvantage on attack rolls against you. For our robe, I went with the Wave Mother's Robe. You have resistance to fire and cold damage, and if you are standing in the water surface at the start of your turn, you are healed for 1d4 hit points. And you also get create or destroy water once per short rest +1 armor class. Now, this create water is actually a 4th level spell, which if you look here, the radius is quite huge, so you can get a lot of enemies wet with a single cast. Then for our gloves, we're going with the Winter's Clutches. When the wearer deals cold damage, they inflict 2 turns of encrusted with frost upon the target. Basically the same effect that the Cold Brim hat has, and also the gloves will trigger the Cold Brim hat, so one cold spell will actually give enemies 4 turns of encrusted with frost. For boots, I went with the Hoarfrost boots. You cannot fall prone while traversing icy terrain. You can also alternatively take the Disintegrating Night Walkers, who do the same thing, but also additionally you can't be enwebbed, entangled, ensnared, and you're also immune to slipping on grease as well as ice. They also give you the Misty Step once per short rest. So of course, if you have 2 people you want to make it so that they don't slip on ice, you have 2 boots here that can do that. For the amulet, I went with the Spine Shatter Amulet. When the wearer deals damage with a ranged spell attack, you inflict 2 turns of reverberation upon the target. And so, what reverberation does is affected entity has -1 penalty to strength, dexterity, and constitution saving throws per remaining turn, meaning it's gonna be even harder for them not to slip on your ice. When the entity has 5 or more turns of reverberation, it takes 1d4 thunder damage and possibly falls prone. So again, you kind of have to be careful with this not to break the frozen enemies free, but if you want to be extra safe, you can just take the Necklace of Elemental Augmentation, which when one of your cantrips deals acid, cold, fire, or lightning damage. There are no thunder dealing damage in the game far as I'm aware. But anyway, they add your spellcasting modifier to the damage dealt, so essentially your Ray of Frost will deal a 5 additional damage depending on what your spellcasting modifier is. So in my case, it's going to be +5. For the rings, we're going with the Snow Burst Ring. When the wearer deals cold damage, they also create a 4.5 circle of ice around them. 4.5 meter circle of an ice around them. So basically, when you hit somebody with, let's say, Ray of Frost, you will also trigger them to roll a dexterity save, whether they fall prone or not, whether they slip or not. Though be careful that if you have allies around them, close to them, basically in melee range, this can also make it so your allies have to roll that same save as well, because the actual radius is quite big, or big enough. For the second ring, we're going with the Ring of Free Action. You ignore effects of difficult terrain and you cannot be paralyzed or restrained. Now, this ring makes it so that we can move normally over ice, we are not slowed down or have reduced speed. If you have a cleric with the freedom of movement spell, this ring is unnecessary, and then you can take Ring of Protection, for example, for additional armor class and saving throws, or you can even take Ring of Mental Inhibition, which when a foe fails a saving throw against one of your spells or actions, they gain mental fatigue for 2 turns. So this can, you can make it so that enemies have to, you can stack mental inhibition on them if you cast Sleet Storm. Because Sleet Storm every turn triggers the saving throw for its effect, plus also the dexterity saving throw. So you can get a lot of mental fatigue stacks quite quickly. For our weapons, we're going with the Marco Heshkir. You gain Arcane Enchantment, you gain +1 to spell save DC and attack rolls. You also gain Arcane Battery, which basically makes it so that you can, if you activate it, you can cast one spell for free without wasting or using up a spell slot. We also gain the Gereshka's Favor, I think it's pronounced. You imbue yourself with an elemental energy source from the Draconic Goddess, and you can of course choose Conduit of Gereshka's Ice. This makes you resistant to cold damage, and it also makes it that your cold spells deal additional cold damage equal to the proficiency bonus, which is in our case going to be +5. When it deals spell damage, it inflicts also 1 turn of frost upon the target while attuned to Gereshka's Ice. You can also cast Cone of Cold and Ice Storm once per short rest. Now this is great because if we add up, so we can deal 1 frost from this effect, we can on first turn, and if we have 2 actions, we can deal another 2 from the gloves, another 2 from the hat, so it's going to be 5. And then if we cast a second spell, the hat will be out of the picture because it says 1 turn, but the gloves will go from 5 to 7, and then another one from the staff will go to 8. So it should trigger the effect of causing enemies to become frozen or taking only half of damage. So in theory, yes, you can in a single turn potentially freeze a bunch of enemies with the big AoE cold spells. For the second staff, we're going to be taking the Morning Frost. When you deal cold damage, the wielder deals an additional 1 cold damage. And we also gain the Insidious Cold. When dealing cold damage with a spell, possibly inflict shield upon the target, which makes the entities, of course, vulnerable to cold damage and resistant to fire damage. So we can also apply weakness to cold them through just use of our spells. Now the alternative staff that I would advise you to carry is the staff you can find in the House of Hope, which has the same effect as the Marco Heshkir, Arcane Enchantment, Arcane Battery. You can use the staff in your backpack, you equip it at the start of your long rest, you activate Arcane Battery, and you summon a Water Myrmidon. This way you will still keep your 6 spell slot and you will keep the Arcane Enchantment from Marco Heshkir, so you essentially will have 2 6th level spells. For the ranged weapon, we're going with the Gaunter Mel. On hit, possible inflict Guiding Bolt upon the target, and also this object shines with glowing light in a radius of 6 meters. These 2 effects don't matter to us too much. The one we want is the Celestial Haste. This gives us haste for 5 turns. Now, unlike what it says here, the creature becomes lethargic. With the Celestial Haste, if nothing is bugged, you should not become lethargic at the end of the effect. That's why it's also 5 turns instead of 10, but also we will have plenty of hastes normally, and usually fights will end before the haste ends, or unless they break concentration, which again is going to be a little bit harder because we have Warcaster. For the alternatives, you can take the Borrow Awareness just so you can get additional initiative. You can also take the Dark Fire Shortbow. It gives you resistances to fire and cold, but also gives you 1 cast of haste. And of course, you could also maybe take Hellrider Longbow, so you gain +3 to initiative. The second effect won't matter to us as we will not be using it as a weapon. We just want it as a stat stick. Alright, so that is it for the equipment section. I will now see you in the battle section. Alright, so here we are yet again at the Flaming Fists barracks for yet another battle showcase. So before the combat had started, I did cast Haste on myself and I drank a Elixir of Vigilance so that I have greater initiative. And I did also manage to get the Water Myrmidon to act on the same turn as my wizard. I just had to deal with one of the Flaming Fists. Now let's take a look at the Water Myrmidon first. Let's go over here because I want to use Healing Vapors away from these guys. Reason being is, once you cast Healing Vapors, it does heal for 2d8, or if the Water Myrmidon is poisoned, it does deal 2d8 poison damage. But namely, we want to cast this is we make everybody in the radius wet and we create a huge water surface. So normally you would want to cast these Healing Vapors in, like, let's say we would use Elemental Warp, get in between all of these fists and cast Healing Vapors so we deal double damage to all of them. But for the sakes of showcase, we will not be doing that because we will probably just outright kill them. Now, from my playing through this and testing, Ice Storm is actually the best spell for triggering Encrusted with Frost. Because if you look here, it either applies 6 or 4 stacks of Encrusted with Frost. So the Wizard got 6, Cross got 4, Colds got 6, and then Thunder got 4. The Cone of Cold is very random, to the point where you can either apply 2 stacks, 4, 6, or 8 stacks, potentially freezing enemies in 1 turn. Now the 8 stacks is very rare. I got it a few times, but it did happen. So if you want to gamble, you can try this. But for the sake of the showcase, we'll use Ice Storm. Now the second spell should not break the freezing, but let's see. So we were unlucky, but we did get all of them to roll the save. She did get frozen, but she also died, so that doesn't count. But if you look here, her corpse is essentially frozen. Let's look at the saving throw. So Gauntlet Thunder, she failed against the Ice Storm. She froze to death, so that basically means if she did survive, she should have been frozen. Now, Cross and Colt, they did succeed the saving throw, so they took additional cold damage, which is fine. But of course, you won't always have your enemies freeze every turn, but again, you will be, if you just use Ice Storm a lot, you will potentially get them frozen anyway. But then if they are frozen, I would suggest not using it because you will free them because of this bludgeoning damage. Instead, use the Cone of Cold to just deal damage without freeing them. So essentially, your combo would be use Healing Vapors on a big group of enemies, and then use Ice Storm on that big group of enemies twice, if you can, to freeze some of them. If you cannot, well then just use Cone of Cold or any other cold spell you might have. Autolook Freezing Spear is also pretty good here because it has a huge radius of area of effect radius, and also it deals pretty good damage. And that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed. I would appreciate it if you leave the like and subscribe for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, and I will see you in the next one.